What we're looking at in this this box, these five objects, represents about almost 2,000 years of technological change. So in the upper left, you actually have a small corner-notched projectile point. These objects came from the same site. At the bottom left, there's actually a corner-notched projectile point, which would date to probably around 1,300 to 800 years ago. The one in the upper left is actually around probably 2,400 to 3,000 years ago. And so you can see these were found on the same site. And so what it shows is continuous occupation of the same sites. What's interesting is the top left looks like it may have been what we'd think of as an arrow point, whereas the one at the bottom actually is much more conducive to what we would expect for something that is more of a dart point for an atlatl or a spear thrower, which also shows that these things are being used that late. The other items in the box on the far right is at the top is the midsection from a knife blade. And then the other two objects are actually end scrapers, so unifaces, which are likely used for processing hides or doing kind of light woodworking tasks. So these are found in interior New Brunswick, and so what it shows is that Atlatl technology that we think comes in around 11,600 years persists right up until probably at least 1,000 years ago and maybe even later. And so bow and arrows are likely a light introduction within the last 3,000 years, maybe even less time than that. But that the Atlatl was a very consistent technology in that it lasted over almost 11,000 years, and so obviously a very, very effective technology for people to use.
And Atlatl means?
Atlatl is it's the Aztec name for the tool, which is actually a spear thrower. So it's a elongated stick with a hook on it, and you would have, if you can imagine the dart that would have gone on these, they're up to 2 meters long, sometimes even a little bit longer, with a large dart point on the end and large feathers on the other end to balance it out. And the hook would actually go into the back of this dart, and when it was thrown, basically it gives you a mechanical advantage. It would almost double the length of your arm, so it makes everybody essentially as effective as a large major league pitcher, like someone like Randy Johnson or somebody, one of those big 6'10" pitchers. And so effective range was about 30 meters with one of these, whereas about 10 meters, with one of these, whereas an effective range is really 3 meters with somebody throwing something with any force by hand. And so it really did extend out the range quite a bit. So, out to something like 30 feet or 10 meters as opposed to something that's really within a couple of steps to get any accuracy and from a thrusting or a throwing spear.
Sounds like the technological advantage of the Welsh longbow.
Yeah, well, that's the other step up, is that when you get to the next extension is the bow and arrow. And so the bow and arrow, essentially you have a much smaller point, but your effective range extends quite a bit, in some cases out to 100 meters. So from 10 to 30 meters at the most for an Atlatl, up to 100 meters. Really, if you're thinking about stalking animals and your success rate in hunting, it means that you don't have to spend all that time to get that close to an animal. Because to creep up to a deer or a moose or a caribou to within 10 meters, that's a lot, and that's a lot of work. And if you miss, then you've got to start all over again. And so it is likely not just how effective they were at actually dispatching the animals. It's likely also a result of how. Because I actually saw there was a replica or a reenactment a couple of years ago where there were some folks that were trying to live like Paleolithic folks, and they had a couple of modern people who had been trained to use atlatls, and one guy on his first throw at an animal hit a full-grown elk in the kind of in the windpipe and dropped it almost immediately. And so, a huge elk can be dropped with one of these because there's so much force and so much energy behind them. The Aztec were recorded to have actually been able to throw these things with such force that they would actually go through the steel breastplates that some of the Spaniards or the conquistadors were wearing. So
It seems pretty obvious walking through the woods that one would grab a stick or maybe even sharpen the stick or pick a particular root or branch that was a pretty good weapon. But the upgrade to putting something stone on the end of it, or that hook that allows you to project it much farther in a battle, required some kind of either practice or mental acuity. Do you have any speculation on how that transition evolved?
So some of these things go back to our at least what Western science would view as our common ancestors. So a lot of the Oldowan complex, which is Homo habilis, or perhaps even some of the Australopithecines may have been making some of these stone tools. There's been a lot of work looking at cognitive development implied through the increasing complexity of tools over time. And so what's interesting is because again, the stone tools represent the inorganics, they're usually what is preserved. But when we start getting into Northern Europe, where you have much better organic preservation in some of these bogs and in cave sites, what you see is around 400,000 years ago, Mousterian technology, which is primarily looking at these Laval-Loire style points that the Neanderthals were making. At the same time, in Germany, they've actually found fire-hardened spears, which are actually sharpened spears which are actually hardened and tempered, basically dried out by repeated firing events in campfires. And so what it likely represents is at any time people have a number of technologies that they're using, and one of the ones, just again because it is likely so effective, is the lithic technology. And so the development of these composite tools seems to have occurred quite early. Our common ancestors, Homo erectus was making, so this would be 1.6 million years ago, to about 600 or 400 million years or 400,000 years ago, we're making these big hand axes. But as soon as they get to, and Homo erectus was traveling throughout the old world, but as soon as those hand axes are everywhere, they're just prolific in producing these, and they are tied to these Acheulean technology. But as soon as they get into Eastern Asia, they disappear. And what people have inferred is that the line where you find bamboo is at almost the exact same line as you stop finding these Acheulean hand axes. And the interpretation or the inference has been, because bamboo is such a useful and ubiquitous, useful tool and a ubiquitous plant, that that's what people started making organic, or our collective ancestors started making organic tools. But they also were still making stone tools. They just weren't making a lot of these formalized tools. And so it's just what it represents is you have very intelligent people for the last over 1 million years making, having a strategy to take animals, process animals, to do woodworking, all of that, and depending on the circumstance, they had either lithic technology, organic technology, or some combination of the two. And so making a sharp stick, you can only make it so sharp. And so if there's some reason, or if there's a tough hide or something that that people are having to get through, it's probably the equivalent of, if we look in Western Europe, of you have a longbow, but the different point that you put on it is dependent upon what you're going to do, whether it's training, whether you're hunting. A lot of the hunting ones are actually blunt, because it's blunt force trauma that actually brings the animal down, rather than, you don't necessarily want the equivalent of a full metal jacket that's going to pass right straight through an animal, because you want it to do massive, or the maximum amount of, impart the maximum force onto the animal that you're going after. And that's probably the same thing that we're looking at here, is perhaps something like a moose is something that always needed because it has a thick coat, and it's a fairly large animal. Maybe that's what atlatls were primarily used for. I mean, again, just a possibility, nothing that's based on any evidence. but that things like birds and geese and smaller animals, perhaps the bow and arrow was better for that kind of stuff. And so, again, oral tradition is important to help us determine whether that was the case or not.
Now, speaking of which, the discovery of firing wood in a fire and making it harder, or putting a stone on the end of a spear, this could have been just happenstance. Someone
Yep.
could have awakened in the morning and found a harder piece of wood there. But then comes the oral tradition of passing that knowledge down to the next generation, and 600 generations subsequent. That's tough.
That's right, and I think what you're seeing with a lot of these things, that's why we start with the most recent, is that what you're looking at is at least in New Brunswick, the collective knowledge imparted and the technological know-how of at least 600 generations, and the generations in time immemorial before that passed it on to those first inhabitants that we currently recognize in New Brunswick. And so, you know, what you're essentially looking at is these are the choice of material, the choice of how to actually reduce the initial parent rock that these would have come from, the choice even of how to haft and the shape of the haft. Those are all things that are obviously imparted from one generation to the next, because we see these things as relatively stable. They will stay fairly consistent for a couple hundred years, and be quite different than the groups or the groups of tools that came before them, and the styles of tools that came before them. So that's likely that's all part of the culture and the knowledge that's being conveyed to successive generations.